I'm talking today with Reverend Neti Petaia, who is based in Rotorua, and with his daughter Philomena Petaia, who is based in Christchurch and is a nurse. And once again, thank you both for making the time to be here and have this conversation. It's very much appreciated that you taking this time out to help me help those that are in aged care services. And this is why I've contacted you, as I was saying to Neti. I write the policies and procedures for aged care services that they apply when they are, to guide staff when they're caring for those in the aged care services. And it might be rest homes, nursing homes, aged care hospitals, and retirement village settings. Sometimes we work with some providers in the community as well in mental health settings and a range of different settings. So it's not just straight aged care or aged residential care, but the bulk of it is. So that's the context that I'm thinking of. Having somebody come from their home in the community, away from their family and coming into care is a huge transition. Yeah. You know, they leave a lot behind, a lot of themselves, a lot of their environment, a lot of their rituals and behaviours and their culture of who they are and what they are within that space. And they have to somehow take that into aged care and still be themselves and still feel like they can be themselves in a way that's comfortable and meaningful for them. So somehow I have to get that content into the policies and procedures to help guide staff. And clearly I can't do that myself. I can do that from my perspective. But we're also, with the new standards, there's a greater emphasis in the new Ngāpurewa Health and Disability Services Standard. There is a greater emphasis on te reo Māori, for Māori content, and also very much so for Pacific people. So the term Pacific people is what's talked about, the Ministry of Pacific Peoples. I've heard the term Pacific Islander, Pacifica. Help me out. What terminology should we be referring to? Tell me a little bit about yourselves first, and where you've come from, and help us start this conversation, if you would.
I would like to start by responding to that question, Gillian, by saying the term Pacific Islander doesn't sit well with me. I'd like to see myself and be called a Samoan, because that's specifically the region of the Pacific where I come from. I don't like being called an islander, because when you use that term islander, it kind of generalizes everybody else. But I'd like to be identified as a Samoan, first and foremost. And every conversation, everything that I engage in my capacity as a Samoan. Because we need, particularly in New Zealand context, we need to be careful in how we address people, because when we generalize everything, you're basically covering everything without specifically, pointing to a specific sector of that whole, and if particularly in the area of delivering services, you really need to be precise in which particular group you are speaking about, because if you talk generally, you're failing to kind of address. Maybe, like sometimes there are specific needs from specific groups within that group of people you're calling Pacific Islanders. But if you be more specific that way, you can actually, in the line of work that you do, you may be able to identify specific needs from those specific groups by addressing them, like I said, addressing Samoans, Tongans, Fijians, because we may come from the region of the Pacific but sometimes our need are different.
Absolutely.
And so I'd like to be, for me personally, I'd like to be addressed as a Samoan. Yeah. Does that help?
Absolutely, it does. Thank you for clarifying that. The term Pacific Islander never sat well with me either, and I have to say a little bit of that does extend over into Pacific peoples, because once again it's generalizing.
Yeah.
You know, am I a Kiwi? Yes. I was born in Waikato. Did I grow up there? No. Does that mean I'm from there and should be treated as though I'm from there and things that might be specific to that region? No, because that's not who I am.
But then again, my daughter might have a different answer, you know, to what I, you know, just yeah.
Yes. So Philomena, bringing this on to you. So Philomena, can you tell us a little bit about what you're doing in your nursing role and help fill in some more richness to this conversation?
Yes, so tala falava and warm Pacific greetings. It is Kiribati Language Week, so Maori, everyone. Currently, I am the team lead, clinical lead here at Tangata Tumotu, which is a Pacific non-government organisation. I look after a staff that cater to our Pacific community here in Canterbury. And we cater to our Pacific communities around the holistic view of well-being. So we range from our youngest client database starts at 5 upwards up to 70, 80. So we do a large cohort of our database is elderly, our matua. And we do a lot around, you know, bringing them and targeting issues like isolation, because most of them, their children work during the day. So it's providing programs as to how to mitigate the issue of feeling, you know, isolated in their own homes. And with COVID now, it's sort of been quite tricky to cater to that and meet the needs of our people. So just touching base on that question that we talked about in terms of what's the correct terminology or the acceptable terminology around addressing our Pacific peoples. For our Pacific people, they have their own personal terms that they like to refer to, like the Rev has said about how he'd like to be identified as Samoan, and you know, we all have pride in where we come from, but I guess from an academic perspective, or when we do a lot of our community leadership meetings, it's a lot of the Pacific people's terminology that gets used, and it's trying to be inclusive. And I mean, if we were to start listing all the different Pacific islands in our meetings, we could be here till tomorrow. So I think we do acknowledge the uniqueness of everyone's identity. But in terms of the different contexts in which we are placed in, terminologies like Pacific peoples or tangata ole moana, I think there's these new terms that are coming through, and there's a lot of literature that's coming out supporting the different terms like tangata moana and what it means, because our people are surrounded by the moana or the Pacific, and most of our our values and our ways of life is around nature and moana, the sea in particular. So I hope that makes sense, or that contributes to the discussion.
It does. And so that leads further into when somebody needs to go into residential care. So let's face it, when somebody goes into a retirement village, that might be by choice. Often when they're going into residential care as in a care facility, it's not by choice. It's because they have a physical need that can't be met within another environment, and they need to go into a residential care setting. So for the staff working in that residential care setting, what are the things first that might be a barrier to access for somebody, say, in your experience from the Samoan community, thinking, no, age residential care isn't for me? What would be something that might be a barrier to them looking at it as an option versus going, actually, yes, I could be there and be comfortable there? Are you aware of any?
I guess when we We've had the privilege and the opportunity to be, before we started nursing training, I worked with my family, really, my sisters and my mum at one of the local rest homes. And during that time, we were fortunate to be working with a Samoan family who had, had to resort to care for their mother because their other siblings had moved out of the country and they were quite busy, and a young family as well. So during that period, we saw a lot of things from the model of care right through to how staff engaged with this particular ainga or family. Then it was a lot around, firstly, how the rest home looked. It was quite uniform. Everything was looked the same. There was no cultural designs or feel to the place. So already she felt out of place. And whenever the family would leave, she felt alone because, some of the staff, it was systems as well, the allocation of how many residents one caregiver had meant that their attention was only limited, and then that resident is left to sit in their room or sit in front of a TV for the majority of the day while they're trying to get everyone else ready. So it's a whole lot of how the place looked was a barrier. The staff as well, in terms of, you can't help but have your favorites, and you obviously spend your time. So it's being, as a caregiver, being mindful of how long or your attention or your care that you're giving to your residents that you've been allocated in that day. A lot of another barrier is also our culture. I think there's not much awareness of what cultural competencies should look like in a residential home. For me, I know, as I'm sure you're aware as well, our Pacific cultures have a strong faith base.
Yes.
So realizing how important that is, things like going to church on Sunday, our matua like to get ready way before. So church could be at 10, they want to be ready at 8 and have breakfast at that time, or they'll be fasting before church. So being mindful of that and being able to cater to matua's needs. It is really sad to see how this particular patient would be up at 7, ready to go, but the caregivers don't get to them till 9:30. And their family are already there waiting to pick them up. So they've had to come in and cook again. And sometimes she won't go because she's just not on the right spirit. So it's acknowledging what it is that our matua value, especially around faith activities. Sunday lunches, there wasn't enough space for their families to be able to host Sunday lunches, which is a massive thing, especially for a busy week for our Pacific peoples. And our Samoan families, our week is reset when we're able to all sit down on a Sunday, just enjoy the food and have that chat. So providing a space for that to happen was, there wasn't really that space. And, rooms are so close together, and you can hear, we can understand that our families are quite loud, and that's just how we are as Pacific peoples. We enjoy in the laughter and the conversations.
There's a vibrance and an energy.
Yeah,
I know.
And the singing as well.
Yeah, so just while we're talking about Sundays and talking about faith, can I go back a little bit and Neti, bring you in here and to this part of the conversation as a minister going into aged care services? How did you feel, or was there a barrier? Were you welcomed? Did it enable you to do what you would choose to do in the way that you would normally choose to do it to meet your practitioners' parishioners' needs?
And thank you for asking the question, because it's the point where I really wanted to make a contribution, particularly when I'm in a context of going into a retirement home where people are waiting for the services to take place, and this has been a major issue for me, because as you know, I used to do the services at the home that belongs to the Methodist Church on you know what I'm talking about. Yeah. And then further down the road towards I forgot the name of the place now. So I look after 3 or 4 different homes in my time in Christchurch, And a common problem is that there doesn't seem to be a great emphasis on setting space for the residents to have the services. I don't know what the problem was, but I did actually write to management of the two homes, because where the space was directly by reception and main entrance. So you're doing a service and you're in the middle of a service with the residents, yet there's people conversing in the background, there's people coming in and out of the building, and you can hear the receptionist answering phone calls, and a lot of, there isn't any intimacy in that space, you know, and you can see some of these residents are quite upset about not having that space where they can engage properly in what they're doing, you know, especially Pacific people. Pacific people, church is something that's more important and value, you know, in their lives, and they don't want interruptions and kind of, you know, and so unfortunately I still haven't heard from any of those management. But I'm glad in this conversation that you're asking the questions, and I'm reflecting on my experience. It's the same here in Rotorua. I serve about 3 different homes here, attending, you know, services during the weekend, Sundays as well. It's the same problem. They just don't give enough emphasis on creating a space where people can actually get together, and then the minister coming in, you know, leading those services. I don't know why, but that may be one of the things that you may just need to address also in putting that, you know, document together, that we do have our faith, and practicing faith is also as important as anything else. Yeah, and so, yeah.
Thank you for really highlighting that. I have heard that from other ministers as well, and it's something that I think may be representative of, you know, the culture of different regions within the Pacific versus New Zealand society, which doesn't have the same proportion often of faith-based, and so some of the staff may not recognise the importance to the individual resident that having the opportunity to have that church service, that spiritual, religious connection, that ability to practice their faith in the way that's familiar to them, and respecting that. So thank you. But
a further comment, Gillian, is also that some of these homes have Pacific workers, carers. And I had a chat with one of them and said, you're a bit upset about, you know, seeing what's happening here. Do you have some sort of feedback into management, you know, as a Pacific person, you know, and seeing what's happened, you know, is there a channel in which you can maybe just, you know, speak to your supervisor or someone above you to address this particular issue? Because for me as a minister coming in, it's really not acceptable, you know, so yeah.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. And I'll make sure that message gets out. This is why it's so valuable to be able to have these conversations, and I hope we can have some more conversations in the future. So carrying on there from, we talked a little bit, Philomena talked a little bit about the importance of family and family connection over kai, over food. What's the Samoan word for food?
Me ai.
Me ai.
Yeah.
Very important. And
so me ai, just to translate that, me ai in the things, you know, and I is to eat, you know, so yeah, as in kai in Māori, yeah, so yeah.
Thank you. So picking up on that again, Philomena, with you, can you talk to us a little bit more about the importance of family connection around food, and talking about how people might spend their leisure time that might be quite different to how they have the ability to spend that time in an aged residential care setting?
Thank you for the question. Because I think it's one of the things that we're currently, because we are in our also policy and procedures process here at our organization, and food often comes up, and this idea of trying to, get rid of the food aspect of our culture is a very difficult thing, and you often see it in our discussions with our communities when we talk about food and we get engagement because of food. It's our Pacific people love our food, and there's different types of foods, and the connections with the family is there's certain memories around the different dishes and why they have it on a Sunday, so that they're able to reflect and remember that. And I feel like that's an important thing when you're as a resident in a residential home. You often spend time reflecting, and that's, you have all that time and you reminisce on how things were like back in the day, because you're often left at the rest home with caregivers or other residents, and they talk about their memories and you talk about yours, and it's often around these gatherings around food, and how when they were younger they used to prepare it. They used to climb the coconut tree to get the coconuts to make coconut cream for whatever dish they were having. So I think I think there's been a focus on the food itself, but for our Pacific communities in a place like a residential home, it's more than just the food. It's the connection, as you rightly said, with families, and being able to provide that space so that can happen. It's part of this holistic care that we often talk about in our Pacific communities, and the model of care around our whānau whale, that, family is one of those major aspects of that whānau whale model. It's the grounding foundation into someone's well-being and how we address and provide care for our families. So I hope that answers the question, probably in a roundabout way.
No, it does. And really reiterating the importance of, not, as you say, it's not just about the food. It's not just about putting an item on a menu and saying, we've done our bit, we've ticked that box. It doesn't look like that, does it? This is about food and the context of the family and the environment, and as you mentioned before, having the environment that allows people to do what they would normally choose to do, and how they would normally choose to connect around and with food.
And if I could just come in on that point, Gillian, is the fact that if you want to get your whole family together, advertise food. That's one way of bringing our people together. And so back to the point about, it's not just food, it's about bringing people in together. It's about maintaining the ties and about maintaining relationships. And that's why it's important, for our elderly generations, they have their own food preferences.
Yes.
And so their generation's preferences is different to our generations and the younger generations. But it doesn't really matter what preferences are. The key thing for us around food is coming together and connections. Yeah.
So the food's secondary is what I'm hearing. That's sort of the conduit to bring everybody together.
Yeah.
Right. So picking up on a comment that you made before, Philomena, about the environment and the decoration of the environment. What does the environment look like that makes it sterile and non-personal or non-comfortable? What can we do better? If you could wave your magic wand and go create the facility that's going to be right for Samoan people, what does that look like?
If it was up to me, it would be a lot of red carpets and gold everywhere. But I think for me, it starts from the initial inter-RI assessment. Often we get our families to come in and they do the inter-RI assessment at the rest home and have a tour of the rest home. But for me, if it was to happen in a familiar space, which would be the home, the inter-RI assessment starts at the home. So the assessor can have a look and see what the home looks like, what their comfortable space looks like, so that they can sort of reciprocate that when they transition into the rest home facility, and being open to allow them to bring stuff that represents who they are, because identity is another big thing, and being able to see yourself and what you're comfortable in the new space, hopefully helps that transition process. So for me, whether that be a fine mat or a tupper cloth, sorry, I've got a few in my office here, but we've got like a tupper cloth on the wall,
Nice.
whether it's a picture of themselves and their husbands, you know, family photos, being able to have the space on the wall and be allowed to put it up, that sort of stuff. Even their grandchildren, photos of their grandchildren, and then there's a lot of cultural stuff that really resonates with them, and they're being able to bring that into the rest home, and you know, often reminds them that, you know, I still have that connection to what's familiar to me, and I'm not completely out of place in the space. So that would be some of the things that I'd like to encourage facilities to really invest in.
Nice, nice. What else could they do to improve, to make it a more welcoming, more comfortable environment where one of the other things, yes, we acknowledge that there's a far greater diversity in the staff that we have in aged care services now, which is fantastic, and it's more representative of the resident grouping and the patients in hospitals and people that we're interacting with. And I'm just thinking about the concept of racism. Now, as you know, because we've had prior connection, you know, I was brought up in the highlands of Papua New Guinea.
Yeah.
And when I came back to New Zealand was actually my first experience of racism. And I was like, what is this all about? And I know that there is still racism, a lot of racism in New Zealand, and dare I say, aged care services as well. And we need to be able to say that that's not present there, that it isn't there, that it's not part of the environment that we're wanting to bring people into, because clearly that you know, it's not okay, and it's an absolute barrier to somebody feeling comfortable and respected and acknowledged and valued. Do you have some comments to make around that?
Definitely quite a few.
Go for it.
I think there's so many scenarios that we've experienced both internally and externally, but it's all on a different level, and it's quite frustrating when it's on the systems level, where racism is seen. But simple things like when families come through the front door, that's the first port of call. Any person visiting a facility, the front of house are the most important people. And if they're not able to welcome or provide that, you know, warmness that we as Pacific peoples, it's part of our values and our hosting nature to welcome people, no matter what color or what race or how they look like or what they're wearing, that they feel welcome at this place. So that's a barrier in itself if the front of staff aren't reflecting that. Even when they walk in and it's just a plain old reception, I think when we're trying to be inclusive of the diversity that's being reflected in the facilities, even a simple thing as the greetings, kia ora, all the Pacific greetings, a bit of color. You know, we're not walking into a funeral home. These are people, it's residents. They're still, you know, we're still trying to encourage quality of life in this facility. So a bit of color will be great. It's you know, and the rainbow communities as well that we have to be mindful of, because it's a bit of racism. It's hard when you're Pacific and in the rainbow community as well. It's a double whammy, and we don't want people to shy away from reaching out for support if we're not providing the correct care and welcoming. So I think for me, it's cultural competency across all levels. Doesn't mean that you're admin, or doesn't mean that you're front of house that you're not part of the staff. You're part of a greater workforce that needs to provide that cultural competence or cultural responsiveness to whoever walks through the door. It doesn't matter if you're Pacific or non-Pacific, Māori, whoever walks through the door, everyone deserves this, you know, to be welcomed.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the interesting thing is, I'm sure every facility would say, oh no, we don't have racism here. It's like, sorry, folks, but you need to look with brighter, wider eyes. Would you agree with Neti?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Sorry to interject, but we've had incidences where in staff meetings in some of the residential homes, we've been told not to speak our language, which for me was I'm quite vocal about when things like that it's for me, it's a disrespect. When you say you can't speak your language in say staff areas or to other residents, because again, we're just creating another barrier into how we can be ourselves or identify ourselves as who we are. You're pretty much telling us not to be Samoan or not to be Filipino even, because we have a number of caregivers who are from the Philippines, and being told not to speak your language, it's like we're taking steps back into how, so that was just something that I always carry with me, and I hope that no facility is doing that, because that's just not on for me.
Thank you for raising that, because I know a lot of facilities do that. You know, and they try and say English is the language that everybody speaks here. And I understand that if you are interacting with a patient in any care environment, you know, a resident in a care facility or a retirement village, and their prime language is English, then yes, English is absolutely right to communicate in. But if you are interacting with somebody that is Samoan, or you're interacting with others that speak that same mother tongue, then absolutely. I mean, you know, there's a huge emphasis for a lot of us to learn more te reo Māori, and you know, this is a good thing. And once again, I think it goes back to that concept of, no, we don't do that here, but actually look at the components of what you're doing, how you're interacting, how you're exchanging, and you'll find that actually it might be more present than you think.
I think it's when you become a victim of that sort of thing, you can easily identify some of that problem, you know, wherever it is. But in going back to that point earlier, I actually got told off for speaking to an elderly resident in one of the places here when I was talking to her, because she knew how to talk English, but she was quite elderly that she hardly speaks English anymore. And she talks to me in Samoan, because that's when she's quite comfortable in expressing her own feeling about her health at that time, and wanted to tell me what is really wrong with her. Her children live all over the world, but she's here in Rotorua. And I got told off for talking to her while the other residents were in the room. And I said, well, if that's the case, find me a room so that I can take this resident to, and her and I can have a conversation. I don't want you to tell me off for speaking the language that is comfortable for this resident. If that's the case, find me a room, because I'm happy to take this lady to the room and I'll talk to her out of everybody else's ear.
So yes, going back to that comment about language is really important. And that was one of the things that I wanted to raise as well. So I'm glad that has come into our conversation. Are there other things that you can think of? We've talked about language, we've talked about faith, we've talked about family and the importance, and food being a conduit and bringing, you know, not being about the food, but that's just a conduit for bringing people together. It's not just about the menu item. Leisure time, you know, a day in the life of, what does that look like? You know, we understand that Sunday is a very special day for a lot of Samoan people and a lot of other people from various different areas or regions, Pacific regions. So are there comments around leisure and what people would like to be involved in or participate in?
A lot of our matua, I think, and reflection here in Canterbury, it is centered around a lot of the church activity. So whether it be choir practices that happen throughout the week, that they are quite diligent with going to and attending, as well as their own matua or friend group gatherings. So they do a lot around kind of like Samoan activities. You have like dominoes, but the Samoan style dominoes. You've got crafting that some of our ladies like to attend. So they'll make leis or headpieces or some of different crafts that are really, really, really very clever in how they do it. So they try and, not only does it keep them together, but also stimulates their mind as well. So as a resident in the residential homes, if they're able to assist with transporting our mātua to those activities throughout the week, they're actually quite busy people, our mātua. They have set days where they're like, oh, don't come see me because I'm going to this activity and this activity. So you can see when the difference between a mātua who's done that all their life and come into residential home and can't do that stuff, how quickly the decline is and how their mental health changes. And it's really, really frustrating as a Samoan person seeing your mātua go through that. You just want to work with the residential homes to make sure that we can maintain what it is that keeps them going and keep them happy. So those are just some of the activities that they do. Even having their friends visit them. It's so crazy how we can't book our nursing home visits because they're like, oh no, I've got a friend coming at 1 and another one coming at 2 and then at 3. And then they just all sort of booked out until 5 in the afternoon. So this 9 to 5 idea of providing nursing care is not how we roll in the Pacific organization that we work with. We know that we work around our Pacific community. So if it's 6 o'clock at night, it is what it is. We have to cater to the need. So I hope that provides some insight.
And that's what we say, isn't it? People come into care and one of the first things they hear is, this is your home now.
Yeah.
And it feels nothing like, and it looks like their home, and it's like, what do you think? This is my home now. This is where I have to stay, but really?
Yeah.
So yeah. These are the things that are important for us. So for people in aged care services that are really wanting to improve on what they're doing currently and picking up on some of the ideas that you've shared with us today, who should they reach out to? Who are some of the resources or the contacts or people in their communities that they could reach out to get more information to help?
Definitely, if there's any Pacific NGOs, I know in Rotorua you've got the Pacifica Trust that's out there. For us, we have Etu Pacifica, which is a Pacifica a clinic, their actual GP provider. We've also got your Alpura nursing-led organization. So any Pacific community NGOs and groups out in the community, they provide different aspects of being able to just explore what's out there, whether it be through, I think we undervalue the importance of community leaders, our ministers, those who hold that status in our Pacific communities. They are probably key stakeholders for facilities to reach out to, and they'll probably connect you to other networks.
Can I jump in on this one? It's because key, as Philomena said, community leaders are key also in this whole conversation. The fact that for me personally, I'm involved in a whole lot of discussion outside of my work as a minister in my church. And I work mainly with the Pacific Trust here in Rotorua. And I sit in a lot of conversation with government agencies, and I've got a conversation coming up in the next couple of weeks with the Ministry of Education around designing some of the programs around Pacifica, students in schools and stuff, involved in a discussion around mental health as well. And so these are some of the things that I'm kind of sad in a way that most ministers that I know and Pacific ministers that I work with, who only see their role as just the church and the walls of the church. But I see our work beyond those walls, because we are the people that becomes the contacts with agencies and government and whatever. in pointing people to the right places and right, to find help if they need that help. Yeah. So
I just want to interject there as well. In our work with our Pacific communities, it's also a cultural aspect as to why we should utilize our community leaders and our ministers. In our Pacific cultures, our ministers are held in a very, in the hierarchy of leadership, ministers are quite up there, and our Pacific peoples respect and will listen to how the messages and things that come from our community leaders. So it's a given that we should be connecting with the people that our people relate to and engage better with. So that's I think that's one of the tips in this role, learning that how important the role of our community leaders are.
Excellent. So just before we wind up today, once again, Reverend Neti Petaia, Philomena Petaia, thank you so much. From a nursing perspective, from a faith perspective as a minister, thank you so much for your time. This has been really valuable, and I'm sure is going to be very, very useful. And I'm sure we'll be talking again very soon.